Here, Breytenbach, who has literally invited us into his home with this session, presenting this paper. We're looking forward to it. As I understood, most of us or all of us should have received the paper beforehand, gone through it, and also read up on Mark. So, Professor Cilliers Breytenbach, the floor is yours, please.
Yeah, Marius, thank you very much, and thank you everybody for your interest. I hope you can see me. The idea of this lecture is to give a first orientation on my view on Mark. The two essays that I've sent to you actually are my last essay on Mark and my first essay on Mark. So there are about 35 years between the two of them. But I will just start with the first one and make a few remarks for your orientation, and then I will carry on and make a few remarks on the second essay, and then the floor is open for discussion, because I think it's not necessary for me to repeat everything that I've written. It is important for me to use the relative cumbersome title of the Gospel according to Mark, because that is the way in which the early Christians created a superscription for the manuscripts. Also kata markon, actually later we can see from other manuscripts it's euangelion kata lukan or whatever. Early Christianity was of the opinion that there is one gospel, and you have a variant according to Mark, according to Matthew, according to Luke. The problem that we have is we do not know who this Mark was. There are a few hunches, and I've written on them in this short introductory essay, but the most material that we have about the author is what we can construct from the text in constructing an implied author. Of course, we also do not exactly know when it was written. The discussion on the date of Mark is not closed. There are people that are saying it was written during the war, before the fall of Jerusalem. I belong to that category. There are also people that say it was written after the war. But there is at least consensus about that it was written around 70. There's also no consensus from where the gospel comes, and there the suggestions are going all around the Mediterranean, from Alexandria through the outskirts of Galilee up to Rome in the west. It is very, very difficult to have a, shall I say, usable hypothesis on that. There's also big discussion on what text type Mark is. And it is on this point that I want to make the most of my remarks today. I think one should distinguish between what we call historical genres and, shall I say, basic text types. From a text theoretical point of view, I would argue that there are a few basic text types, like narratives, arguments, lists, descriptions, and maybe texts that take up other texts like commentaries or midrashim also. Of course, you can, when somebody produces a text or produced a text in antiquity, you almost always have a mixture of these different text types, but normally one of them is overarching. One could argue that the letter to the Galatians is basically an argument. It's an argumentative text. But of course, its genre is not an argument. It comes in the historical genre of a letter. I would argue that the Gospel of Mark is basically a narrative that does not clear the question what historical genre you could link it to. There has been different proposals on that. People have said that it could be an imitation of texts like the Exodus narrative. Some have compared it to the Hellenistic novels. Others make an argument that it belongs to the Hellenistic biography. I would regard this question as open, and maybe in future we can talk about that. I say it's firstly more important to see what type of narrative Mark is. How does this narrative work? And I've suggested that we call the Gospel of Mark an episodic narrative. Now, an episodic narrative is a narrative that consists of smaller units, and all these units together are not just linked to one another in a, shall I say, haphazard way. The little narratives together, the little episodes together are subjected to a narrative superstructure. They make a big narrative as a whole. In the second paper, I go into that. But I have a few more remarks to make about Mark. Mark is extremely important for a, shall I say, array of reasons. The first one is that I think there is growing consensus that Mark is the first gospel. So if you want to tackle the question of what type of literary genre the Gospels belong to, you have to start with Mark, because Mark was the basis for Matthew and for Luke, and most probably the Gospel of John also knew Mark. They were all dependent on Mark. People that support the two-source hypothesis, like I do, would say, okay, well, there was also a trajectory like Q, but you cannot study Q properly because you do not really have a text, and it's very difficult to explain early Christian literature by making a reconstructed or a constructed text the basis for everything. So I would like to stick with Mark. Mark has, on the other hand, not been that shall I say, influential in the church history. If you look at the first essay, I've made a few remarks on the reception of Mark. Apart from having Mark in a second, third century papyrus, papyrus 137, who whole history about the publication of this papyrus, made some, shall I say, huge waves in Oxford during the last couple of years because somebody tried to sell this papyrus illegally. But it's a very, very small snippet. But at least it is documented in the second or third century in papyrus 137. But in the next earliest papyrus, where Mark is attested in papyrus 45, Chester BT1, one can see that Mark comes off after Matthew. So there was already in the 3rd century a tendency to regard Matthew as more important than Mark. This maybe has to do with it that Matthew is longer and contains more material. But this whole idea of giving preference to Matthew was made much stronger when St. Augustine put the theory into the world that Mark shortened the Gospel of Matthew. And that led to it that during church, the years of the early church and the medieval church, there were very, very few commentators and very few homilies on Mark. The few that we know about, and there might be more, Joshua is busy with a huge project in trying to find all these references to Mark in the through church history. The few we know, we can say, there are not very many of them, and I have them here in the essay if you are interested in the reception of Mark up into the Renaissance time. Mark really gets its turn in the middle of the 19th century, or shall I say in the 30s of the 19th century, as when the discovery of Karl Lachmann comes that Mark was used by Matthew and by Luke. In those times, people were looking for the best source to write a history of Jesus. And then they thought, well, now we have the earliest gospel, we have Mark, and we will study Mark. And for the latter part of the 19th century, Mark has been studied very much as a life of Jesus. And if you would look to the earliest commentaries of Mark, for instance, by Heinrich August Wilhelm Meyer, or also by Bernhard Weiss, they think they are now commenting on the life of Jesus. Unfortunately, for those who are interested in writing lives of Jesus, William Brede came in 1901 with his Messianic Secret, and he burned this bridge between Mark and the life of Jesus by showing us that Mark is, in fact, a story of a much later narrator about Jesus, told from the perspective of the belief of the early church that Jesus was the Son of God and that he was resurrected. But Brede made the important remark that Mark is a narrative and we must understand this narrative, but nobody really followed Brede, and there was the long time of form criticism and redaction criticism until in the 80s, end of the 70s, the end of the 80s, the Gospel of Mark was studied more as a narrative, and then specific narrative traits were analyzed. People analyzed Mark as a tragedy, other analyzed Mark as a comedy and whatever. And this is almost, shall I say, the situation in which the second essay had his origin. I think for the moment I should stop here and give you the opportunity that we discuss the first essay. And I take it, Marius, that you will moderate the discussion.
Hi, thank you for that. Sorry, I was just with somebody on the line. Thank you, Prof. Breytenbach. I will moderate the conversation. My suggestion would be is at the bottom right corner of your Skype screen, there's a open conversation. There's a little icon that looks like a bubble. Just click on that, and if you would like to ask a question, make a comment, give me an indication there, and so I'll just moderate there, and you can go ahead, unmute your mic, and continue with your question or comment. So the floor is open for questions, comments, please. Anybody? There's a.
Yes, I have a question.
please, please just identify yourself and continue.
My name is Michael Sokupa. Thank you very much, Professor Breytenbach, for this insightful paper. My question is regarding the narrative approach to the Gospel of Mark. Appreciate the introduction and orientation you have given to your paper, and along with that, you've given a little more detail in the paper regarding the narrative style. My question is regarding the interpretation of the Gospel and methodology. In approaching the Gospel of Mark, is it the only Gospel that is approached with a narrative methodology, or does this apply to all other Gospels? Is this unique with Mark, this narrative approach, or is it an approach that applies across all Gospels? And to what extent, in terms of methodology, do we follow the more recent approaches to narrative text and genres? That's basically my question.
Yeah, thank you for your question. Mark was and still is, to a great extent, the incubator of gospel methodology. The first narrative studies on Mark originated in the 70s. It originated especially within the circle of students around Norman Perrin. And when Norman Perrin left redaction criticism or expanded it into narrative criticism too, actually he spoke of composition criticism. This was a very, very big issue in the 70s. Now, if you are young and not old as I am, there are many things that you take for granted for the time that you live in. But in the end of the 70s, it was a really bone of contention to say that the Gospels are narratives. I can tell you a little anecdote. The person that is responsible for the introduction of narrative criticism in gospel studies in South Africa was Willem Foster. He did this in his inaugural lecture at UNISA, I think in 1978 or 1977 it could be. And he said we must read the Gospels as we read stories. Now there was a banned book those days that was written by Andre Brink. And he said we should read the Gospels like this novel of Andre Brink. That was all over the Sunday newspapers the next day, and he almost lost his chair because of this, shall I say, the storm in the teacup that came. And Bernard Combrink will still remember this very, very well. So this approach that came from Perrin and others slowly and gradually developed. One of the first essays was an essay by Norman Peterson, who said we should investigate the point of view of the narrator in Mark. Another one was by Robert Tannehill, to study the disciples as a narrative figure, a narrative role within the narrative. Up till then, it was practice to say, well, what was the source of a gospel? In Matthew's case, it was quite clear. He used Mark, and then we looked at the little changes that Matthew made to Mark, the redaction he did, and that was the way in which Gospels were interpreted. Now, when the narrative criticism on Mark took off, it was very quickly also applied to the other Gospels. One of the more important books is a book on The Anatomy of the Fourth Gospel by Alan Culpepper. Another important one on Matthew was a book by Jack Kingsbury, and then Robert Tannehill himself analyzed Luke Acts as a narrative document. Today, it is, shall I say, commonplace to analyze the Gospels as stories and that they work as narratives work. But then we must know two things. We must know from a point of view of narratology, how do narratives work? How do you go about as a literary critic in analyzing narratives? And the second thing that you must remember, you can never completely analyze the Gospels as if they are fictional narratives that have no, shall I say, basis in community tradition. People who were reading the Gospel of Mark or listening to the Gospel of Mark when it was about one of the main characters in Mark, like Peter, of course, also had a memory of Peter in the early church. And this memory of Peter in the early church interfered with the reception of the story that is told. So that was a long answer, but I hope it answers your question.
Yes, thank you very much. Just a follow-up. In terms of the methodological approach, I remember when, the issue of the genre of the epistles that you referred to with Galatians came up, there was a drive towards going back to epistolary writing of the times. Is there such a methodological source from the times, literally speaking, that would help us today in our narrative methodological approach?
I would distinguish a little bit in what you say. Basically, I agree, but you must remember it is quite clear that the letters in the New Testament are based on private letters as a specific genre from antiquity. They are, of course, expanded and have their own specific peculiarities. It would not just start like we all write letters today, I hope you are still healthy. They start with a liturgical formula, for instance, giving wishing the grace from God the Father and from Jesus Christ the Lord to the readers, which is a Christian peculiarity. But basically, the early Christian letters were letters that were meant to be read out loud to the congregation. But in these letters, you have specific textual forms or strategies. For instance, in the letter to the Galatians, chapters 1 and 2 are basically narratives that Paul tells a story to substantiate his argument. But in chapter 4 and 5, in chapter 4, he has a kind of a midrashic exegesis of the two women of Hagar and Sarah. So within the letter, you have argument, you have exegesis, you have all sorts of things within the letter itself. But basically, it is a letter. Now, Mark, we do not know what genre it basically is. It uses arguments in some short pericope. Think about the whole Beelzebub controversy. That is an argument. But it also has a lot of shorter narratives within this narrative. So I will say, let us stay on the formal level and say the Gospel of Mark is a narrative. It's mainly an episodic narrative. And once we've analyzed this properly, we can see whether it can be compared to specific historical genres. Now, the reason why I make a difference between Mark and the letters, by writing letters, the Christians adapted a practice among the ancients to write letters to people that they cannot visit. The letter is a kind of a, shall I say, substitute for being absent. Whereas in the case of the Gospels, the reason why the Christians have these Gospels is because there was a story about Jesus. They do not, in the first instance, tell the story about the passion of Jesus because you end a biography by telling about the end of Jesus' life. They have a passion of Jesus in the gospel because that was the oral tradition that they had about Jesus, and they were telling this tradition. So it might be that the form of the Gospels as we have it is much more determined by the tradition that is in it than by any type of historical genre of that time.
Thank you. I would like to give Prof. Jan Tomme an opportunity to comment, please.
Yes, Cilliers, thank you. I find both your articles that you present very interesting, and I think the overall theme seems to me be a very, very important address, an important question, and that is, among other things, the role of narrative, the function of narrative. So, and this also relates to the previous question about historical genres and whether, you know, your narratival approach has anything to say about historical genres. I think what has become more important recently, instead of simply classifying a text or categorizing a text as a specific genre, it is to look at the purpose of the text, the social function, the purpose. One of the recent publications in Novum Testamentum supplements was by Paul Robertson on the genre of Paul's letters. But I think what he said is also applicable to this question, and this is that the form of the text is not so important as the purpose that the text had. And I think the question that we need to think about in this context is, what are the social purposes of specific narrative texts? So if you have a biography, the ancient biography would be one example, the purpose would probably be to instruct, inform the people, the readers, about a specific person's, important person's life, maybe with some moral, but it be more of historical interest. While I think if we look at a gospel like Mark, there's much more to it than just to tell people about Jesus's life. I mean, you addressed this in your second essay, and I think it also, there's an interesting aspect to it, the fact that it has an open ending, or rather the resolution, the ending is outside the text. It comes after the text. So that shows that the function of the text is different than just the story about the life of Jesus. So I think when we think about the gospel in general, but especially about Mark's gospel, we have to think about the purpose that the author had, and not simply try to fit it into a specific known historical category.
Thank you, Johan. I fully agree with that. There has been a tendency recently to make the Gospel of Mark, to classify it as a biography, to classify all Gospels as biographies. I'm very skeptical against that approach. I think there are two main arguments. The Gospel of Mark tells us almost nothing about the life of Jesus before he starts his public appearance. And the second thing is the main, shall I say, line of action in the Gospel of Mark. It's not about Jesus, it's about the coming of God's kingdom and the return of the kingdom when the Son of Man comes. So there are people that say that the main character of the Gospel of Mark actually is God, who is the driving force behind all the action of all the figures in the narrative. I wouldn't go as far to say that he's the main actor, but it is definitely so that the Gospel of Mark is about the gospel that has been announced by Isaiah. It is, shall I say, it is engitsein, it is coming close in and through Jesus, and it will come in the end when Jesus returns as the Son of Man. It is about God's reign, and the purpose is not, in the first instance, to inform about Jesus, but to give to the audience orientation on how they should act within this situation where the coming of the Son of Man is imminent in their own time. So to classify, to force a text too soon into a historical genre and the limits of that genre is, I find, methodologically not correct. You first have to analyze the text for what it is, and I say first analyze it as an episodic narrative, and then compare your results with the results of other texts that might be similar.
Yes, thank you. No, I think this is very helpful.
Anybody else with a question, a comment, perhaps? Jeremy, please go ahead.
Hi, Jeremy.
Jeremy, you're welcome to pose your question.
Thank you very much, Peter. I'm just trying to see if I can get through. Can you folks hear me? More importantly,
yes,
can you?
I can hear you. Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. So yeah, great to see you, and I can show you that I now actually had time for a change to do some shaving. So I look a little bit different from you and from what I've looked last time around. But it's good to see you, and it's great to hear all the other voices. Michael Sukupa, particularly you, I trust you are still far away in the US, so it's great that you are also joining us. Cilliers, thanks for the discussion so far, and thanks for the presentation, and also, more importantly, perhaps, for the paper that you've seen. I want to latch on a little bit with some of the latter part of the reasoning, and so apart from the notion of considering the particular say social purpose of a writing, I'm a little bit more hesitant about the authorial aspect. You know, not that I don't think authors don't have particular intentions, but I just think it is hardly possible for us to find those. So, but linking up with that sort of notion that documents have purpose, that even if people just scribble, they still do it for a specific reason. Even if they're just doodling while sitting on a Skype session, they are still writing with some purpose and focus. But that's difficult for us to determine. So here's my question. You suggest that episodic narratives, that looking at Mark as an episodic narrative is a useful way of understanding Mark's gospel. So what for you makes this a more worthwhile approach than, say, looking at it as a tragedy, or as a kind of a epochic kind of writing, or a biography, or whatever sort of other construction we can use to try and look at this gospel. So in short, what's the particular value and spin-off? I mean, apart from the academic argument that you think that's the more appropriate way of identifying the nature of the text, what sits in this description of Mark as an episodic narrative that you think constitute value for us and makes this a useful way of describing the gospel?
Thank you, Jeremy. That's a helpful question. I think one can answer it on two levels. If you go to my second essay, the second part of the paper, you will see that I talk about the difficulty of structuring or classifying Mark. There are so many classifications as there are people classifying. The reason for that is people think texts are flat. They are, you know, like shall I say, a piece of sausage that you can cut into specific sections. But they're not like that. They're more like trees. You know, they have branches, and they have dimensions in them. And you get these different layers of a text better with the model of episodic narrative, which I have taken from Aristotle. Now, you would know all that Aristotle said, well, you know, the mythos of a literary work has a beginning, a middle, and an end. That, of course, applies to tragedy and to the epos. But the important thing about the episeidou is that some part of the content can be portrayed in a single short episode. You have, for instance, in Mark, only one episode where the whole issue of how should the Gentiles be treated is developed. That is in chapter 7 on the Syrophoenician woman. But this does not mean that the people that are not Jewish are not a topic within the gospel, but it is exemplified in this one episode. There are other important topics in the gospel that is never exemplified in an episode, but it comes, shall I say, almost every time in single episodes it is kind of referred to. But I think distinguishing between the individual episodes and the major story and development of the themes that keeps the whole narrative together, that it becomes not episodical, is very, very important. And the notion of the notion of an episodic narrative gives you the possibility to have these this level. But I think you want to follow up, Jeremy. Or somebody wanted to follow up.
Yes, Jeremy, you're welcome to follow up with an, please.
Thank you very much. And so, yeah, thank you very much for that. And I want to agree with what Johannes said earlier as well. It is indeed, I think, I also find it a very helpful way of looking at a text and trying to make sense of how a text is constructed and to try and follow up and try to follow the communicative lines of the text, as it were. But can I then push a little bit further and ask, when we say that, and also linking up with what you've just said about the danger of looking at a text as a flat entity, when one uses terms like, and I'm putting you a bit on the spot, Cilliers, but when one uses terms like, on page 13, you talk of the pulling together a superstructure, for example, whether that may not be somewhat misleading when people read it, in the sense, well, misleading is too strong a word, but whether it may not conjure up a wrong image, in the sense that people may think of an episodic narrative as something that is already, as we would say in Afrikaans, in kanne en kruike, as if it is kind of like prefabricated. It is there in the text, and all that remains for us is this. We just got to be super Sherlock Holmeses, and then we can go and extract it from the text, as opposed to the fact that we acknowledge that yes, there are certain lines, and yes, there are certain major themes and topics, but and that there is a certain amount of arrangement that are around in these texts, but that what we do with a narrative is that we, more than finding, we are more constructing, that we are that in our process of making sense of the text and its structures, that we make a contribution to that, and that we, what we call then, as you also do, macrostructures and superstructures and microstructures and thematic elements, that a lot of what we do is constructive work rather than reconstructive work.
Jeremy, I agree completely with you. I think one should say, one should put this into perspective. The moment that you say a text is a narrative, of course you presuppose an idea about what a narrative is and how narratives work. So at the time when I wrote this, I was very deep into continental narratology, and people like Elizabeth Gurlich and Walter Kinch and Thierry van Dijk have text models about how they think texts work. But what one must realize, as we are on the receiving end, as you are now listening to me, I'm kind of trying to explain something, but what you hear is the continuous letters or syllables of my evanescent voice. In order to construct my argument or my explanation, you have to make a construction. Now, that's not different when somebody is telling a story. People heard the words, the phrases, the episodes one after one another in Greek, and they had to construct something. I say just in constructing this thing, is we should not just construct a major plot as you would have done with the theoretical tools that you have in Seema Chapman or even in Jeanette or whatever. You need a model that makes provision for the fact that the ancients often told stories by linking together episodes. And there are examples like that from ancient literature. And that is why Aristotle developed this category of episodic or the forming of episodes. And he uses it for the tragedy and he uses it for the epos. And I say this approach has a kind of a dynamic in mediating between the levels that we have to construct. We are not only constructing one level, we are constructing, as I say, we are constructing a tree. And in the end, maybe you can construct the trunk of the tree and the roots that carry the whole thing. But of course, it is your construct as a reader of the text, and we can only try to agree we all have the same text, and as a reading community we can say, well, this is a construction that has some kind of intersubjective validity. But I say the tools with what we do that is better if you were to take this notion of a episodic narrative based on a narratological model as a point of departure.
Declan, the floor is yours. You're welcome to pose your question.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. I found both articles very interesting, and I just want some clarification. Are you hearing me? Hello? Hello?
You can go ahead. We're hearing you. You can continue.
If we consider the Gospel of Mark as episodic narrative, that means each episodic narrative might have their own formation.
I don't care about that last because one need the devices with the dark place.
Of course, I'm assuming here as a form criticism, and each episode narrative might have also their own narrator. So even though they might have superstructure which unifies the whole topics, how the gospel we have unifying narrative which have their own narrator. That means, what if some episodic narrative have a different narrator?
Excuse me, I didn't hear you that well. Maybe you can just repeat the last part of your question, and maybe you can come a little bit closer to the microphone.
Okay, let me try. What I'm trying to say is, if you take the Gospel of Mark as an episodic narrative, that means those episodes might have their own formation. If you take form criticism here, and that means all episodic narrative have their own narrator. And so if they have their own narrator, and if some of the narrator they have a different, if episodic narratives have their own narrator, and some of the narrator might differ, and how can we have the unifying narrator.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. This is again an important point that you are raising. Maybe some of you have seen babushka dolls. These are kind of Chinese dolls, and there's a doll in the doll, and in the little doll there's another doll, and in the doll there's another doll. They fit into one another. Now, the Gospel of Mark have basic little narratives. You can say, let us take the narrative in the beginning, the opening narrative in chapter 1, verses 21 to 28, where Jesus starts teaching in the synagogue in Capernaum. That's on a Shabbat. He again teaches in the Shabbat, on the Shabbat in Capernaum in chapter 3, verses 1 to 6. And then he also teaches in the synagogue in Nazareth in chapter 6. Each of these stories is a narrative on its own, but they contribute to a larger narrative. But how Jesus is teaching in the synagogue. So, of course, one has to analyze every single episode as an episode. But the difficulty in interpreting Mark is to put the narratives together to as one big narrative. And the only way to do that is to look at those parts of the gospel that are not really episodes on their own. They function as links between the episodes. For that reason, the prologue is immensely important. But by reading through the gospel, seeing how the different layers work, I've made a construction and say, okay, this is what I think is the major plot behind all these stories, keeping these little stories together. And that I have explicated on the paper when I talk about the not in 2.2 narrative text within the gospel, but in the 2.3, the narrative macrostructure of the Gospel of Mark. We can see that the Gospel of Mark mainly has two sceneries. The one scene is in the first half, Jesus operating from the house of Peter and Andrew, from Capernaum, in, shall I say, expanding circles from Capernaum into Galilee, unto the borders of Galilee. But the whole action is circles around what he calls the Sea of Galilee. The scene in the second part of the gospel is between Bethany and the temple. And that keeps these little episodes together. And then you can say, what is the action line that is driving it forward? Well, as I say, the first action line is that the kingdom of God is at hand. And in this first story in the synagogue in Capernaum, you can see what that means. That means that the power of the demons have been broken because Jesus is able to expel the unclean spirits from the man in the synagogue. So how is the kingdom of God coming near? What is meant by the kingdom of God? All the little stories have to do with that. In the second part, you suddenly hear, but Jesus, who is the harbinger of the kingdom, is going to be killed. He's going to die in Jerusalem. Then the reader asks, well, what is going to happen with the kingdom now that his main agent of the kingdom is is going to die. So the narrator integrates the passion of Jesus within the story of God's kingdom coming. But of course, I say that this is my construction of the plot that lies behind the little stories. But you have to do it on this level, first looking at little episodes and then looking at those parts of the narrative that aren't self-contained episodes on themselves, but are repetitive, come again, are dependent on the episodes. That helps you to make this larger reconstruction. A good example will be the three prolepsei that are used in chapter 8, 31, 9, 31, 10, 31 to 33, where Jesus foretells his own suffering and his resurrection. Those are not episodes on their own. They are embedded into other episodes, but they structure the little episodes and they tie them together under a common topic.
Thank you so much. Let me add one question. Do we have an example from ancient resource on non-fictional narrative on this type of reading, or this type of episodic narrative?
Yes, there are a few that are episodic. The life of Homer is a episodic narrative that has quite a few differences to Mark, but it's also a kind of a episodic narrative. And I thought that would be the next chapter in the book, is on texts like that. I think to compare the Gospel of Mark to the life of Homer is one of the, shall I say, more fruitful types of comparisons. Because also there you have it, as you have it in Mark, you have in Mark quite a substantial volume of the words and sayings of Jesus. But if you look at the Gospel of Thomas, there are big differences between Mark and the Gospel of Thomas, because in Mark, the sayings of Jesus are integrated into the story, especially they are integrated into Greyei, or what the form critics called apophthegmata. They are situated in a story. Jesus is going to the sinners, and the Pharisees and the scribes are not satisfied with that, and then Jesus says, those are sick are in need of the doctor, not those who are healthy. It's a typical Greyei or a apophthegma. So it is a story that it's told, but these stories are in the developing plot. They are part of the conflict that is developing between Jesus and the scribes and the Pharisees as his opponents within the Gospel of Mark. In, for instance, Demonox of Lucian, you also have apophthegmata, but you just have a list of the different things that he said, just a list of them. They're not integrated into narrative action. And if you compare texts from the ancient world with Mark, you have to look at texts that have similar characteristics in their narrative style than Mark has. That helps us further, not by saying, okay, what are the characteristics of a biography? Do we find these characteristics in Mark?
Thank you so much.
Prof Bernard Kombrink, the floor is yours.
Dankie Pieter. Cilliers, ek weet nie, kan julle my hoor?
Ja, goed.
Lekker om te sien en lekker om weer te hoor. Ek wil net twee kort goedjies vra. Jy het nou pas ook verwys na biography. Nou moet ek ver teruggryp na goed wat baie vaag is, maar 'n bios van die antieke tye is tog glad nie soos 'n tipiese biografie van ons tye nie, alhoewel ek ook nou miskien nie ons biografie se genre so goed verstaan nie. Maar is 'n antieke bios nie tog, jy het nou na Homerus verwys, is dit nie tog ook tot 'n mate hierdie tipe van episodiese narratief nie? Dit wil ek maar nou sommer vra. Die ander ding wat ek net wou noem, is die vraag oor hoe bepaal ons met watter doel? Sorry, I'm speaking Afrikaans. With what purpose the gospel has been written? And I very much agree with your kind of analysis of building up from the smallest structures and the different levels of narration. My question is, although we should acknowledge and grant that we all have our own reading of the text, and even in this reading we construct, isn't there a certain rhetoric in the way that in the end this is put together that will show us in the direction of the purpose that is not so susceptible just to individual interpretation, but we are within the bounds of the rhetoric, the rhetorical thrust of this whole construction of the narrative, as you pointed out, how important the prologue is and how different themes are taken up in this way, in a sense, trying to conclude to the purpose. Thank you.
Yeah, Bernard, I will start with your second part first. Of course, I agree with that. Is what do we have as exegetes? We have, shall I say, Greek uncials on a vellum codex. But that is a thing. That is a phenomenon. It is not nothing. So in the end, what we construct must be related to those complex signa that are on that pages of Codex Vaticanus, because that is a real thing that exists. Of course, we have to interpret there, but we cannot construct something that has nothing to do with the empirical evidence on that manuscript. And that's where we must find one another, and that's what is good and exciting about scholarly work. In a discussion like this, people name mark and say, well, shouldn't we construct it like that? Shouldn't we construct it like this? But there is room, of course, for difference, but there are also criteria that would tell you this is an inappropriate construction. You cannot, to put it simple, make a future out of a imperfect. And within those, to take it from the basic mythological level up till, shall I say, the function of prolepsis, the function of narrator's commentary within a work, there are indicators that can help you to make this construction. And my claim is that scholarly work as exegetes must be like that, that an intersubjective control between people who know Greek and have a common theoretical basis must be possible. If that is not true, I think we shouldn't be wasting our time by everyone just making his own construction. And there's a very, very important essay by Umberto Eco that he gave in Constance at the home of reception history on the limits of interpretation. And where he argues that the semantic base of a text, the interpretation of the text, should guide all its further constructions and use. And I think that is important. So I agree with you on that. And what I am working on are distinguishing the levels that we have to look at, the methodology we can follow that can help us to have a intersubjective, controllable hypothesis on the purpose and the meaning of a text. To come back to your question on the BIOS, yes, of course they are different, and there are people that have strong arguments that the Gospels are related to the ancient Bible. What you must realize is the first thing that Matthew and Luke did when they took over Mark, they thought there's too little about Mark's childhood, about Jesus' childhood. So they expanded the story of Mark into the beginning years. They were also very dissatisfied about the ending of Mark, and they added a lot of material about the resurrection appearances. Of course, we know they differ greatly between Matthew and Luke. So there might be tendencies to develop the genre of the Gospels into the direction of a biography. But those things are not in Mark. And what is important, that very many of the biographies that are used as comparison do not tell like Mark. Mark has a dramatic way of telling. He sets Jesus's words dramatically into a scene where Jesus interacts with his opponents, and there are dialogues, a lot of direct speech, and so on and so on. There are not that many of those texts that are used as comparanda that have that. But as I say, there are some, for instance, like the life of Homer does that. So I would like the people who propagate the idea that Mark is a bios to be a little bit more careful in their selection of comparanda. I mean, I can just repeat the joke that one of my colleagues made, who was an ancient historian. He said, you know, there is a great similarity between a mosquito and an elephant. They both have trunks and they both have tails. But the big difference, there's only a little difference between them, and that is their size. So I think it is important to see that what you compare is compared with a specific purpose and is compared with a set of questions that are relevant. And I say the questions that are relevant are, you have to look at the specific narrative traits of Mark and then look at texts that have similar narrative traits before comparing.
Thank you very much.
Martin, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. I found this very stimulating paper, and I went through Mark's Gospel yesterday and coded it, you know, like a good researcher. And I found your paper fascinating. And then I woke up in the middle of the night and I said, what on earth happened to the demons? Because in the first part, up to Mark chapter 9, there's demons here and demons there, and there's lots of demonic stuff, and you touched on it earlier. Yeah? But then suddenly, after Mark 9, they disappear. And I got up in the middle of the night and I read those last chapters. So what I would like you to comment on is, what's the thematic importance of the demons in Mark? And then what's the importance of their disappearing? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
How does it work?
It's a good question. It's a difficult question. Let me tell you what I think their purpose are. In the beginning, one must see that that's why the prologue is so important. What happens at the baptism is a event that takes place between the heavenly voice and Jesus. There's nobody else that knows that Jesus is the Son of God. The readers are privy of this information, but all the other characters in the story want to find out who Jesus is. But Jesus is the Son of God because he has been given the Spirit. And this Spirit drives him into the desert. And there in the desert, he is tested by Satan. But he comes as, shall I say, victor out of this scene. And we see that in the first episode where he's able to expel the demons in the synagogue. But they are privy because they are on the demonic side in this big drama. They are also privy of his identity, but he does not allow them to say that. So the whole first part is, amongst others, about this battle between the demonic and Jesus, who represents God's reign. And in this sense, the episode on the Beelzebul controversy is very, very important, because Jesus can expel the demons because he has bound the strong man and can go into his house and can steal his property, as chapter 3, 22 onwards until 30 says that. So that refers back to the scene in the desert, that he bound the strong man, the Satan or Beelzebul, and the kingdom of God is conquering the demonic powers. And up till then, the demons want to tell who Jesus is, but he does not allow them. From the middle of the gospel, in chapter 8, Jesus begins to tell his disciples that he will suffer, and he will be killed, and he will be raised. And from that point, you only have this one in chapter 9, and you never have the demons again. Because the problem in the second part of the gospel is not what is the interaction between Jesus and the demons, but what is going to happen to Jesus in the light of the announcement of his rejection, his passion, his death, and his resurrection. So they are only a figure in this first part of the gospel. Now you would ask, why is it like that? I think this is like that because you cannot understand Mark if you just analyze Mark as a story, as if it were a fictitious story that Mark sat somewhere and he thought out this whole thing. Mark is based on tradition, on memory from the community of believers, and in this community of believers, there was a tradition that Jesus, when he was in Galilee, was a kind of an exorcist. And people said, where is this power coming from? And it was known that the Pharisees and the scribes said, he called because you have this tradition in Q2, I would argue. So these stories are used by Mark to create this episodic narrative. So there are, although all stories that we have are told by Mark, are told in his style, it is not like that he has fabricated all these stories ad hoc to have a nice story to tell. He is always working with tradition and trying to bring the tradition into a coherent, continuous story. So I would in the end say that the tradition about Jesus and the demonics was part of the Galilean material that the Gospel of Mark's community had from the cultural memory in Galilee.
Any other questions, remarks, comments? If not, I'm going to hand over to Marius, if you would like to say something and maybe conclude in a way by...
Hello.
Hello, Marius.
Can't complain. No, Cilliers, from my side, much appreciation for this initiative from your side. And we've had wonderful number of people participating. And I think it went very well. We could hear you very clearly, and I think the discussion flowed well. So from my side, much appreciation. And this is something to reconsider, even if we are scattered over different continents again, that we can do similar sort of link-ups in the future.
Yeah, well, thank you for the opportunity. I think it's always much more fruitful when one has the text beforehand and one can read it and can ask then questions than using the time to present the content.
Yeah. So from my side, Peter, especially to you who have chaired the meeting and made all the technology possible, and Estelle who got all the Skype addresses together, and for everybody signing in, we appreciate this your time and participation, and we will keep you informed about maybe possible future possibilities. So thank you for all of you for participating.
Thanks, Marius. Thanks.
Yeah, again, I thank you, and you would have seen that the text that you've read is a kind of a manuscript that is about to be published. So if you have discovered the typos that are still there, please let me know.
Thank you. Good afternoon to all.
Okay. Goodbye.
Cheers. Baie dankie. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Goodbye. Thank you.
Goodbye.